Meeting to order. Welcome back to meeting number 80 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Today we are meeting in public to discuss committee business. In accordance with our routine motion, I am informing the committee that all remote participants have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. When we suspended on Wednesday, November the 29th, we had resumed debate on the sub-amendment of Mr. Falk. And Mr. Patzer had the floor. Just to remind everybody, Mr. Sorbrera had moved a motion. We later had a sub-amendment, an amendment moved, and then we had the sub-amendment of Mr. Falk, and Mr. Patzer had the floor. And now we will continue through with our speakers list after Mr. Patzer. Mr. Bruson, I had you next on the list. Did you still want to speak on the sub-amendment?
No.
No? Okay. Mr. Jenis, you had raised that you wanted to speak. You now have the floor, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. It has been a long time coming that I've been seeking to have the floor here at the Natural Resources Committee, and frankly, we've seen an unprecedented situation that has limited my ability to have the floor. I had the floor; it was taken away. We had instances of I think. Extended problems and confusion and misstatement of the situation of interpreters by the chair, and I have been in and out throughout that process. But I am grateful for the opportunity to finally be able to address the committee about an issue that is extremely important to my constituents. That is this government's anti-energy.
Question de règlement, Monsieur le Président. Juste.
Point of order.
A minute, we have a point of order from Monsieur Simard. Monsieur Simard, go ahead.
Simplement pour qu'on.
Simply, to be very clear, my colleague has just indicated that there was a poor interpretation by the chair concerning the interpreters. I would like him to explain what he's referring to when he said that there was a poor interpretation on the part of the chair concerning the interpreters. Because if what he's raising is the fact that there was a lot of people speaking simultaneously on the Conservative side, which wasn't allowing me to have simultaneous translation, I don't think that then it's a poor interpretation on the part of the chair. I think that it's rather a poor way of proceeding by my Conservative colleagues who are not at all concerned about the well-being of the interpreters and also who are not at all concerned about the participation of Francophones in the debate. So I would like him to clarify his statement on this subject.
Thank you, Monsieur Simard, for your point of order. I think this is also a good time to remind colleagues on the importance of interpretation, which has been raised that only one member at a time speaks through the mic, so the interpreters can effectively and do the great job that they've been doing through all the meetings here at our committee and interpret. And it does become quite challenging for them if numerous speakers have their mics on and are speaking, where it makes it difficult for interpreters to effectively interpret for the benefit of all committee members. Mr. Jenis, thank you, Mr. Simard, for that point of order. Mr. Jenis, I'll come back to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Just to reply to my colleague, I have a lot of respect for the importance of bilingualism and the French language. And obviously, your intervention was not about rules. It wasn't a point of order, but I would like to respond to your point. The reality is that the chair lied to the committee. He was saying it was a question of health when there's a situation where many people are speaking at the same time. Obviously, in that kind of situation. It's difficult for the interpreters to do their work, but it's not an issue of health. That was the issue, and I think we discussed it earlier. But I do welcome the opportunity to repeat my position on this matter. Obviously, it wasn't ideal when many people were speaking at the same time, but it's not an issue of health, of the health of the interpreters. I think that's clear now. But we had received some information that was not correct.
We are now discussing committee business, but I think it's important to say in the context of that discussion of committee business that we now have a motion that has, I believe it was initially debated, in fact, so it's now begun debate in the House that would seek to impose an approach to consideration of this bill on the committee. This is motion number 31. And this is an unprecedented, egregious, and very draconian approach that the NDP Liberal government is taking, imposing a very specific timeline on this committee around Bill C-50, a timeline that is completely different from the approach that committees would normally take. And this limits our ability to hear from any of the witnesses that the motion we're currently debating would propose to enable us to do. The motion that is being debated before the House, put forward by the government and by all indication with the support of their coalition partners in the NDP, says that in its consideration of this bill, there would be, in effect, no witness testimony. So that the committee would have to amendments would have to be submitted by 4 o'clock the day after the motion was adopted, which it seems the government's intention is that the motion be voted on today. So amendments would have to be submitted by 4 o'clock tomorrow. The committee should meet at 4:30. Pardon me, at 6:30 on the second sitting day following the adoption of the motion.
Mr. Janice, I'd ask you to pause for a sec. We have a point of order by Mr. Bruson.
To relevance, we're not debating the motion that's in the House. We are in committee at this moment, and I believe that what we have before us is a sub-amendment that was brought by Mr. Falk to call witnesses from Timmins. So perhaps if Mr. Janice can get back to the sub-amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson. I just will remind colleagues that we are on the sub-amendment introduced by Mr. Falk on the inclusion of Timmins James Bay, witnesses from Timmins James Bay. So I'll ask the member to, as you proceed in your debate on this important sub-amendment provided by Mr. Falk, that you keep it relevant to the importance of the members, stakeholders from Timmins James Bay to be able to participate in this. So,
point of order, we've got several new members.
So, sorry, we have a point of order by Mr. Falk. Mr. Janice, I'll just ask you to turn off your mic if you don't mind, just until Mr. Falk is done. Go ahead, Mr. Janice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we've got several members that are typically members of this committee here today, helping us debate this very important sub-amendment, but they don't all have copies of the sub-amendment. I'm wondering whether the clerk could circulate that.
Thank you, Mr. Falk, for your point of order. We will circulate the sub-amendment to all committee members, and I want to welcome the committee members who have joined us today for the first time. Ms. Barham, welcome. Mr. Brock, welcome. And Mr. Janice, welcome as well for joining us today at committee, and Ms. Latanzio as well online. Mr. Janice, back to you so you can continue your debate on the sub-amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will remain relevant as I always have, but maybe to make it explicit for Ms. DeBruzen, who I'm sure is following intensely every word that I'm saying. Mr. Chair, the motion before this committee relates to the business of the committee, the study of bills, in particular, including Bill C-50, and the amendment and the sub-amendment deal with what witnesses would be called during consideration of that bill. But meanwhile, we have a motion before the House that, if passed, would make it impossible for this committee to hear from any witnesses. The government, with their coalition partners in the NDP, are moving in the House to impose a shutdown of debate here at the Natural Resources Committee. Committees are supposed to be masters of their own domain, and we could be debating this sub-amendment based on the idea that we actually get to decide. But it is the intention of the government to rob us of our historic and ancient rights and privileges as a committee. That is to impose upon us this draconian situation where we would not be able to hear from any witnesses. So that is not merely tangentially relevant to the point. That is the point, because the sub-amendment is about which witnesses we would call. And this motion from the House, which I was discussing before being interrupted by Ms. DeBruzen's point of order, this motion in the House would make it impossible to hear from those, make it impossible for the committee to hear from those witnesses. So again, the motion, which I believe, based on the government's scheduling and intentions, it appears to be their intention to impose the passage of this motion by the end of day today. Today, this being December the 4th, which means that tomorrow would be the deadline for submitting amendments, and that the committee would meet. It says the second sitting day following at 6:30 to begin clause by clause. So I believe that means 2 days after. So that would be Wednesday, and that it would have 2 hours to do clause by clause. And if by 8:30,
Mr. Janice, I'll ask you to pause for a second. We have a point of order from Mr. Bruson.
I just wanted to clarify for the member opposite, because he is relatively new to this committee today. We are actually still on October 30th in this room, in that strange place where this filibustering from the Conservatives began. So in fact, we are not on December 4th. We are in a meeting of October 30th. And if we had in fact been able to proceed on October 30th, we would have been hearing witnesses by this date. I just wanted to clarify, because he may not realize what date we're actually on in this room.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson, for your point of order and your remarks for clarification. Mr. Janice, you have, Mr. Janice, before you proceed, we have a point of order by Mr. Falk. Mr. Falk, go ahead.
Yeah, just I would like just to make it very clear that, on Friday, Ms. DeBruzen spoke in the House very passionately about Bill C-50 and about the work of this committee. And she made a declaration in the House on Friday, said that she's looking forward to hearing witnesses here at committee. And she knows full well that the motion that's presented by her party would prevent any witnesses from attending committee. And so she's being very duplicit in her comments between the House and our committee. And I think she should just maybe take an opportunity to clarify what she meant on Friday in the House by saying she's looking forward to hearing from witnesses that she know will never appear.
So thank you, Mr. Falk, on the point of order. We have a point of order from Mr. Cervera.
Two things on my point of order, and whether it is or not, you'll be the judge of that, Chair. First thing, Mr. Falk is absolutely correct. My colleague, MP DeBruzen, has a real passion for Canada moving to a net zero economy, because we know the economic opportunities for workers from coast to coast to coast is enormous, and we'll continue demonstrating that passion, whether it's through policy or whether through its debates. And MP Falk, you mentioned something about my colleague, MP DeBruzen, and you used a word which I will not repeat. I think you should give it consideration and withdraw that word on MP DeBruzen, please.
Well, if you're saying two different things, what is it?
So, colleagues, I would ask all members of committee to use our point of orders for procedural concerns that we may have. And I would also ask all colleagues to make sure we use parliamentary language in how we conduct ourselves at the committee today, and always from how we've conducted ourselves in the past and today and into the future. It's important that we conduct ourselves by using parliamentary language here in the House of Commons, but also here on the Natural Resources Committee. Thank you. We have a point of order by Mr. Brock.
Point of order, Chair. Is that, I just want to clarify, is that the ruling of the Chair that the use of the term duplicitous by my colleague, Mr. Falk, in pointing out two different versions from Mr. Bruson with respect to the state of the witnesses and the urgency by which he wants to hear these witnesses? Have you ruled that to be unparliamentary?
What I've asked colleagues is to use parliamentary language. I'm not referring to any comment made by any member, but we should refrain from using unparliamentary language at committee. It's a reminder that I'm providing committee members at today's meeting.
Well, if that's a ruling that the use of the word duplicitous in the point of order by Mr. Falk, I would be challenging your ruling on that, sir, because in my view, that is not unparliamentary. It is not derogatory. It is merely pointing out two versions of fact. And Mr. Falk, I believe, and in fact, all members of this committee have a right to know exactly where Mr. Bruson stands on that particular issue.
So, Mr. Brock, you are challenging a ruling I made, and I will ask committee members if they'd like to sustain the ruling of the chair if you're challenging my ruling. Is that what you're doing, sir?
I need to Chair to clarify whether or not the use of the word duplicitous, you have, as the chair, have ruled that to be unparliamentary, as opposed to your description of being mindful of unparliamentary language in this particular committee. I think everyone at this committee needs to know exactly where you stand, sir, on the word.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Chair, I'm not done speaking yet. I think everyone at the committee deserves to know if you feel that the word duplicitous in relation to the comment by MP Mr. Falk is ruled to be unparliamentary.
So, Mr. Brock, what I was referring to was the use of parliamentary language here at the committee, not on any terms or words used by committee members. I just asked all committee members to ensure, as we conduct ourselves through the meeting, as we have in the past, as we have today, as we should in the future, that we use parliamentary language. I did not refer to any specific word that any members made, but I want to make sure that all committee members respect each other, have a workplace here for everybody that has that mutual respect, and that we just consider language used as we move forward that is parliamentary, and we do not veer off that. I hope that clarifies
it does.
And answers your point of privilege. And we also have a point of order by Mr. Dreeshen, so that's dealt with that, Mr. Brock. I'm going to go to Mr. Dreeshen on his point of order. If you still have a point of order, I'll come back to you. Go ahead, Mr. Dreeshen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe you'll find that the issue here has more to do with what Mr. Sorbera had mentioned as he attempted to present to the committee that there was an issue from us indicating that this particular word should not be mentioned. And at that particular point, instead of indicating that from everything that you have ever heard, that such a word would not have been considered unparliamentary, had you mentioned that to Mr. Sorbera, then we would not be in this position at this point in time, because the problem is that if we don't stop that at the moment that it is presented, then we can get into a situation where anybody can challenge a word, and unless they are challenged back by the chair to indicate, sorry, that is not an unparliamentary phrase, then we will get into this situation constantly. So in order to help the committee, I believe that if you were to address what Mr. Sorbera had said and indicate to him that nowhere in any precedence does the word duplicitous sound as though it would be unparliamentary, then I don't believe that we would be at this position. So I think the issue isn't so much with the relationship of things that Ms. DeBrusen has said. It was because of the intervention from Mr. Sorbera, and that is what we are dealing with, not going back to the stage with Ms. DeBrusen.
Thank you, Mr. Dreeshen, for that. As I've clearly said, based on the point of orders that have been presented, number one, that we should just all conduct ourselves to make sure that we are using parliamentary language and not using anything that would not be parliamentary towards each other. And number two, that we do not use our point of orders to engage into debate. As I've said to a number of members, we focus on the procedural relevance of the point of order. So thank you, sir, for providing that. We will move forward to Mr. Brock. Do you still have a point of order? Because I do want to get back to Mr. Jennis, who has the floor.
I do, and you may rule it not to be a point of order, but since that the word duplicitous has not been deemed by the chair to be unparliamentary, I would like a response, if possible, from Mr. Bruson to clarify the discrepancy.
Thank you for your point of order, Mr. Brock. If a member would like to provide that when they do have the floor, I'll offer and relate it back to the sub-amendment that's being debated. The member can do so. But I think will move forward to back where we were, and Mr. Jennis had the floor. Okay. Mr. Falk, do you have a point of order?
Yeah,
you can turn on your... Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, usually they're kind enough to do that for me, so thank you, Mr. Chair. But that, yeah, I'll try and remember going forward that I can press the button as well. Thank you. You know, Mr. Sorbero did make an accusation, and that there was a word that I'd used in my previous intervention that was unparliamentary, and I think you do need to make a ruling on it, sir, whether it was unparliamentary language or whether it was a word that is just very descriptive of the circumstance that actually we found ourselves in. So I think for Mr. Sorbero's better understanding and ability to make further interventions, he needs to know whether, in fact, he was making a valid point or not, and that's a ruling, sir, that you should make.
Thank you, Mr. Falk, for your point of order. As I've stated and numerous times, that we focus on ensuring at this committee that we don't use language that is not parliamentary, and I'll stick with that, and I ensure everybody can move forward to proceed in that manner, so we have mutual respect and working together on this committee. Thank you for all your point of orders, colleagues. I do want to get back to Mr. Jennis, who does have the floor. And Mr. Jennis, we have no more point of order, so you do have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're in unprecedented territory for this committee, that we've exhausted the available points of order, and that I, having had the floor, have been allowed to continue to have the floor by you, the chair. So these are some noteworthy developments given the recent history of the Natural Resources Committee. I will respond to the obviously not a point of order from my colleague opposite. Initially, Ms. DeBrusen, who said that who objected to my use of the term December the 4th on the basis that it is, in her view, not December the 4th. I was referring to a motion before the House. And in the House, as on the rest of the planet, it is undisputably December the 4th. At least most. I think the time zones line up right about now that it is, in fact, the case, more or less everywhere. But she said it's October 30th in this room because we're continuing a previous meeting. And her point, I think, was to try to get out there the allegation that this is some lengthy filibuster process or something. I would just remind everyone in terms of how we got here and where we're at. This has not been sort of the sustained process of Conservatives making arguments about the motion before the committee. Quite the contrary. Actually, what we've seen at this committee over the last month or so is consistent objections to the complete miscarriage of process because we had a situation in which one member had the floor and then was arbitrarily deprived of the floor. And this was a matter that was discussed extensively over multiple sessions of this committee that went on for a number of weeks. It was not a matter of debating the motion in those exchanges. It was a matter of asserting the privileges of members of Parliament, the right of members to be able to speak and raise their concerns before the committee. And I think anyone would find, if they review the discussion that took place in those instances, that in fact the vast majority of the speaking being done was by the NDP Liberal coalition. I think it is clear if you say who's talking is taking the time, that in fact over the last month most of it has been Mr. Brusen and Mr. Angus. I think that's fairly clear. Although Conservatives were trying to get the floor to try to raise specific comments about this legislation, the important issues that it raises, and the debates that need to take place around it, that we were in a situation where it was Liberal and NDP members speaking, raising points of order, interrupting, not allowing members to have the floor, that was clearly the cause of this process having continued, such that, formally speaking, we are in a committee meeting that began on October the 30th, although it's been suspended and scheduled under the circumstances relatively sparsely by the chair. And all of these things are things that are beyond the control of Conservative members. We have sought to put some specific points of concern on the record, and we have been snowed in by interruptions, points of order, and flagrant violations of the rules. I think the worst was when, on multiple occasions, Mr. Angus used flagrantly unparliamentary language and was allowed to do so by the chair, even when points of order were raised at that time. So this is what brings us to this point where Conservatives are looking for an opportunity to set the agenda of the committee in a responsible way and to speak to our concerns in the process about aspects of this government's agenda, an agenda which which aims to shut down highly productive parts of our economy and force workers who are working in those highly productive parts of the economy to no longer be able to work in those sectors. The doublespeak associated with the phrase "just transition" is, I think, by now extremely clear to workers and to everyone who follows these discussions, that when the government says just transition, what they mean is to shut down critical industries in our economy, the effect of which is likely to push those jobs overseas and to leave Canadian workers with very few options, but maybe under this rhetoric of just transition to offer them welfare payments. I mean, the folks who are working hard in the energy sector, who are benefiting from energy-related extraction and manufacturing, they're not looking to be transitioned to government benefits. They're looking to be able to have the opportunity to continue to work in their field, in a field that is a growth field globally. That the Canadian energy sector is leading the world. It's leading the world in terms of improvements in environmental performance, and this is why Conservatives strongly oppose the absurd doublespeak associated with the government's so-called just transition agenda. It's become so clear to workers that this rhetoric is aimed at shutting down jobs that, in fact, the Labour Minister admitted to the House that he no longer likes using the term just transition because workers don't like it. Quite strikingly, he admitted as much. He told the House that he doesn't want to use the term just transition anymore because the workers he talked to don't like that term. Well, yes, they don't like the term, but they also don't like the substance of it. So the government trying to change the verbiage they use to describe their agenda without changing the substance of the agenda, it hasn't fooled anyone before, and it's not going to fool anyone now. The fact is that the Liberal NDP coalition has been consistent in not standing up for workers. But we want to hear from workers at this committee. And this is what we have been saying from the beginning, that we want to be able to have hearings in a...
Point of order.
I suspect it's not a point of order.
Mr. Jenness, I just ask you to pause for a sec. We have a point of order by Mr. Sorbara.
I have just a question for yourself and the clerk. I believe that the motion that I submitted was done on October 30th, correct? Yes.
Mr. Sorbara, the motion was moved on October 30th
Yes.
By yourself.
And how many meetings have we held on this motion, the amendment, and the sub-amendment, and so forth, since October 30th, that we could have studied and invited witnesses to this meeting?
Order, Chair. Point of order. Is this point of order?
Yeah.
It sounds like I'm being interrupted on the other side because they don't want to actually recognize the fact
You're being
that we've had
interrupted
about
because you don't know what a point of order is,
meetings.
Francesco. It's not a point of order.
It's not for you to judge for what I do or do not know, Garnet. So
But
please hold back there.
well,
Thank
certainly
you very
you're
much.
speaking as if you don't know. So maybe you know, but you're
colleagues,
speaking contrary. But
I'm going to ask
the things you're
everybody,
saying imply
this
that
is
you
maybe
don't
a
know.
nice time for a reminder for everybody here. When we acknowledge a point of order, one mic on at a time and one person speaking into the mic at a time, because it is difficult for our interpreters to interpret multiple colleagues on committee speaking into the mic. So I would ask colleagues, for the benefit of the interpreters, to be able to interpret in both official languages, that I hear a point of order from one individual before proceeding to another. Thank you, Mr. Sorbara, for your point of order. Colleagues, I just want to remind everybody that we did have a motion moved on the floor on October 30th by Mr. Sorbara. We subsequently had an amendment moved and a sub-amendment moved and another sub-amendment moved by now Mr. Falk, which we are currently debating. So we have been debating this since October 30th. And today we're on December the 4th, and I think that provides clarity on times and dates for everybody and the number of meetings we can add up in between and the hours that we've been working on this here at committee. Now, I hopefully that addresses any concerns or that members had. I will go back to Mr. Jenness, who has the floor. Mr. Jenness, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Chair. I appreciate your generosity in restoring the floor to me, which, of course, is consistent with the rules. Clearly, Mr. Sorbara's point was not a point of order. It was a point of debate, and I'll respond to the point of debate before continuing.
Point of order,
here we go.
Chair.
Here we go again.
I'd like to
Mr.
go back
Jenness, I'll ask you to hold again. Mr. Sorbara, go ahead.
I'd like to raise the point of relevance, please, for Mr. Jenness. Thank you.
A point of
So, I would ask colleagues to...
I was responding to your point. Clearly,
Mr.
it's
Jenness,
relevant if yours was.
Mr. Jenness, I'll ask you to hold, please, until I acknowledge you. On the point of order that's provided, Mr. Jenness, I just ask you to keep it relevant to the sub-amendment brought forward on Timmins James Bay by Mr. Falk and continue to proceed. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Jenness.
Thank you. I think we may want to set a record for how long a person can speak before getting interrupted by another point of order. Am I still good? Okay. So, Chair, I'll do another sentence and see if Mr. Sorbara has any objections. He had said that it was a point of order. It was clearly not a point of order when he intervened to claim that that it was somehow a matter of order for him to. The camera's preemptively going to you. Mr. Chair, Mr. Sorbara was saying that it
Point
was...
of order, Chair?
Oh, here we go. I knew it. I knew it was coming.
So, Mr. Sorbara, on a point of order.
Too far
I'm
into
very thrilled that Mr. Jenness is speaking about me and as the MP for the beautiful and wonderful riding of Vaughan Woodbridge. I would love that the committee turn its attention to the millions of hardworking Canadians and workers that would benefit from
Precisely what I was talking about before you interrupted.
From Bill C-50, and that we could get to voting on their amendments or sub-amendments and so forth, and that we can get the conversation on relevance. This is not about me, Garnet, or myself. This is about Canadians. This is about labor. This is about working together with industry, and this is what Bill C-50 is. Not about Francesco, not about anybody in this room. Should be about them. So let's get back to
You interrupted
relevance.
when I was
Thank you, sir.
discussing
Thank you,
precisely those matters.
Mr. Cervera, for your point of order. I'd ask colleagues to just keep your debate on a point of order. Let's not use point of orders for debate, but also that the individuals who do have the floor keep it relevant to the conversation at hand on the sub-amendment that's been provided. Mr. Falk. Mr. Brock, on the point of order. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like the chair to be aware that the last, and I've lost track, quite frankly, but at least the last 2 points of order by MP Sorbera were not points of order. They were debate. And quite frankly, if he wishes to engage in this type of intervention, which is clearly what it is meant to stall the ability of my colleague, Mr. Jennis, to actually get to the point. He's raising issues of relevancy. That's not a point of order, Chair. You know that. Perhaps I would just, as a suggestion to Mr. Sorbera, that he listened to the actual statement made by Mr. Genuis before he raises another point of order. The last two, he was literally interrupted midstream before he actually got to his point. So I hear what he's saying. He wants to move this forward, but his own actions defy that logic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brock, for your point of order. I would ask colleagues, Mr. Brock, as you've stated, and also have said in your own comments that we don't use point of orders for debate. We have had a number of point of orders over the last month and a half, 2 months, that have been used in committee as opportunities to debate. So I would ask members to ensure that you use your point of orders for procedural relevance. And I would ask members who have the floor to ensure that their debate is relevant to the motion, the amendment, but in this case, the sub-amendment that Mr. Falk has brought forward on this important topic. So, Mr. Jennis, the floor is back to you on the sub-amendment. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wasn't sure how long that would go on for. I will resume the points I was making previously with respect to the substance of this issue. I just will say in passing that Mr. Sorbera raised 3 points of order in quick succession, first interrupting the points I was making about workers, and then saying on the third point we should get back to talking about workers. I hope I don't cause a flurry of disorder by saying that this is the kind of duplicitousness that we have come to expect from my colleagues opposite, who are, in one instance in this committee, claiming that they want to hear from witnesses, but I expect planning on supporting a motion in the House that would make it impossible for this committee to hear from witnesses. And this is what is happening. This is what people need to know. And this is what is really an unprecedented attack on the ability of our democratic institutions to do their job. The way the legislative process is supposed to work is that bills, when adopted at second reading, they come to committee. They're considered in committee. In the process of consideration, there is a consensual process around hearing from a certain number of witnesses, and then ultimately the individual clauses and related amendments are put to a vote, and that the committee is able to use its expertise on the issues at hand to be able to study the bills and their effects. Parliamentary committees are not supposed to be simply a rubber stamp process. They are supposed to be a substantive investigation of critical issues by the members who are tasked with being on this committee and therefore becoming expert in the particular issues associated with it. That's why we have parliamentary committees. That's a critical reason why we have a legislative process in general. Too often, this government has treated Parliament as if it's some kind of a rubber stamping sideshow. No, Parliament, and in particular parliamentary committees, are essential to the process of crafting good legislation. And we have been trying to establish a good process for working through this legislation. I think if you look at the extended committee meeting that has been ongoing for the last month, you will see that the majority, if not the vast majority, of the talking has been done by members of the NDP and the Liberals. There have been constant interruptions, almost no opportunity for members of this committee to actually put thoughts on the record. I had an experience early on where I was planning to speak to this issue, and I had the floor arbitrarily taken away from me by the chair. But we have had many instances throughout where, just as we've just seen across the way, when reasoned attempts to make arguments about the substantive issues associated with this legislation are being put forward, there are constant interruptions. So I think the claim by the government that this is some kind of sustained, sustained filling of the time by opposition members is just not consistent with the record. The record is very clear here in terms of what has been going on. Nonetheless, we have, as I have been trying to identify for the last half hour in the midst of interruptions, we have motion number 31 that the Leader of the Government, the House of Commons, has put forward that radically abridges the committee study process, that effectively eliminates the committee study process on Bill C-50. It would give once adopted, it would give members less than 24 hours to submit their amendments, which is extremely limiting given especially the constraints around legislative drafting. The legislative drafting team do great work, but demanding a turnaround of a couple hours if there are multiple complex amendments is obviously quite unreasonable. And you have many. Even the ideas that we would want to hear for what type of amendments would happen, the possible refinements for those amendments that should be coming. We will not be hearing from the witnesses because witnesses will not be able to appear. The motion created by the government, it involves no witnesses, no ministers, even no ministers coming before committee to actually explain their position around the bill, and it envisions a process where after a mere 2 hours of clause-by-clause consideration, the committee would be subject to a procedure whereby there would be no debate whatsoever on the clauses. This is in Part 4 of the government motion.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
After 8:30, all remaining.
Janice, I will ask you to hold, please. We have a point of order by Ms. Lapointe.
I'm just going to ask for relevance on the sub-amendment that this committee is currently dealing with from Mr. Falk.
On the point of order, Chair.
I'll ask Mr. Janice just to hold a sec. Thank you for your point of order, Ms. Lapointe. I would ask the member just to keep the relevancy of how it pertains to Mr. Falk's sub-amendment that's been presented by our colleague, Mr. Falk. So, Mr. Janice, if you could keep it connected to that. As you debate, go ahead. You have a point of order on...
Mr. Chair, I wanted to actually, now that Ms. Lapointe has decided to intervene on this, I wanted to highlight the fact that a while back she had accused me of unparliamentary language, and I had asked her to simply say what I had said was allegedly unparliamentary, and she didn't even respond at that time.
Mr.
So
Janice,
Ms. Lapointe has comments. I would
Mr.
welcome
Janice?
her to clarify her earlier accusation, and she won't, of course, because she didn't then, and she has nothing to stand on. But I would encourage
Mr.
her
Janice,
when making accusations against other members
hold, please.
to actually have in mind what she's accusing them of.
Point of order.
I will ask you to hold because there is a point of order by Ms. Jones. Go ahead, Ms. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Janice's comments has no relevance to the debate here today. And for a point of clarification, Mr. Chair, I'd like to say we have had since the end of October to bring witnesses to this committee. It has been the choice of the Conservatives to delay the proceedings.
Point of order, Chair. Are you allowing members to just make editorial comments and calling them points of order?
Relevant information as a part of this debate, and that's the reason we have not been able to get to witnesses.
Chair, are you enforcing order here?
Ms. Jones, for your point of order. I will remind members, Mr. Janice and others here, when I turn on my mic, this red light comes on. That is an indication for all members to pause in their intervention. And we don't have multiple members speaking through the mic for our interpreters. We all know the interpreters do a tremendous job and a great job to interpret in both official languages. Now, I want to make sure that they can continue to do that. But when there are multiple individuals speaking in the mic and speaking over each other, it makes it difficult for the interpreters. Now, thank you for the point of order. I would also remind all members around the table that we do not engage into lengthy debate as we use point of orders, that they only be used for procedural use on a point of order. Okay, so I'm going to remind everybody that, and now I'm going to go to the next point of order. Mr. Dreeshen, you have a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would hope that you believe that I do not use points of order into anything other than points of order. I would submit to you that if once you recognize from any member here that it has gone into debate, that if you would stop the comments at that particular point in time, that we would not have to worry about the issues that you have had to address. So you have had experience here. You can recognize when it is debate. If you simply say that it is debate and shut the mics off at that point in time, then we won't have the issues that we seem to have at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dreeshen, for that reminder, and I will remind colleagues as well. I use a soft intervention of first turning on my mic to allow members to look towards me and see when my mic's on, to pause, and then I ask members to pause in their thoughts so I can intervene, because I do respect the work of our interpreters, and I want to make sure that they can follow along and interpret, and that's the approach I've taken, and I will continue to take. And I do not want to speak while others are speaking into the mics, because it does make it challenging for interpreters to interpret. So I ask all colleagues, when you do make a point of order, to make sure you're maybe kind of looking towards me so you can see that my mic is on or off, and so I do not have to interrupt you. But I do appreciate you making those remarks, Mr. Dreeshen, and I will reflect on that as well. We have another point of order by Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones, go ahead on the point of order.
Thank you. I just want to add to what Mr. Dreeshen is saying. I totally agree that any points of order should not be debated and should be relevant. And I also ask you, Chair, to give more guidance to the relevance of the content of the debate. Most of the interventions has been regarding relevance of the subject matter, and if we could have more rulings on that, we could probably avoid some of the points of order.
Thank you, Ms. Jones, and you are correct, as you've stated, that we want to ensure that the sub-amendment we are on, which is on Mr. Falk's sub-amendment of making sure that stakeholders from Timmins, James Bay can participate in the work of our committee, that we focus on the sub-amendment and keep it relevant to that. So we've exhausted all the point of orders, I think, now. No, we have not. We have another point of order by Mr. Brock. So, Mr. Brock, go ahead on the point of order.
Thank you, Chair. And this is meant to offer information only. There's been a lot of discussion regarding the issue of relevancy. In my former career, Mr. Chair, as a member of the legal system, the term relevancy has a subjective element to it. It's not objective. So my experience, as limited as it is in this 44th Parliament, I'd like to finish my thought before I get point of ordered, because, yeah, I'd like to finish my thought, Mr. Chair. So the issue is, my experience on a number of committees, I have seen chairs provide a certain degree of latitude when it comes to interventions by members. And when the issue of relevancy comes up, I have been to at least a half a dozen. I'm not suggesting that you have to follow suit, because you are the master of your own domain in terms of how you conduct yourself, sir, in this committee. But we are bound by rules at parliamentary committees. And I always find that there is a degree of latitude when it comes to relevancy, and that you afford the member to eventually get around to the concept of relevancy. Just because an opposition member feels that the issue of relevancy is not within the first, say, couple of sentences of the intervention by the member, it's not to suggest that the entire intervention itself is devoid of relevancy. So I simply ask, and this is for information only, that you provide a degree of flexibility to every member of this committee to get to the whole issue of relevancy, knowing full well that relevancy, in my view, is a subjective element. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your point of order, Mr. Brock. I would just ask committee members to on what you've stated, but we do keep it relevant to the motion at hand and try to just to ensure that all committee members have the ability to participate in debate under this important sub-amendment. But we also, as stated as well by yourself, sir, that we do not use point of orders to debate extensively our thoughts on a point of order, rather get to the procedural aspects of the point of order. Now, that we've had that important conversation regarding those point of orders, we will proceed. And I see that Mr. Jennis is no longer here, and we will move to the next member we have on the list, which is Mr. Dreeshen, who now has the floor. And welcome, Mr. Redekop, to committee today as well. It's great to have you. Mr. Dreeshen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And a few days ago, I had a chance to speak to both yourself and the clerk, questioning whether my following statement would be a point of order, and you suggested no, it's best for me to bring it up when I have the floor, so I have patiently waited for that. In my last intervention, I had misspoke, and I had indicated that it was a company by the name of Hoverlink that had to go and get funds from the U.S. for through the Canada Pension Plan in order to fund. And I had made a mistake. It was actually from testimony from Mr. Zombar Barani, who had said that he had to get a $250 million investment for his telecommunications company. There was no Canadian funds that he was able to get. So he had to go to the U.S. It actually ended up being a U.S. Becoming a U.S. company, but that the irony, of course, was the fact that the funding of it came through the Canada Pension Plan. So that was, and I apologize for having made that particular mistake at that point in time. But I did want to make sure that the record was corrected. So that is the first thing that I had wanted to mention. In my remarks, I had gone through a number of different issues, and again, one of them I had mentioned, the text of a book by the name of Factfulness from Hans Rosling, where we, as politicians or business people, we have certain ideas of what is happening in the world, but it's based on the things that our experiences and so on. It's not necessarily fact. And if you start to take a look at the way in which countries manage themselves, we see that things are a lot better off in the world than we perceive them to be. And one of the questions that they had posed, and this was posed to people, extremely intelligent people around the world, says the average grade level of young boys, 30 years old, that had had 10 years of school, and then they made the comparison. So how many years of school do you think a young lady that is 30 years of age would have? And so, I mean, it was 9 years, 6 years, 3 years. The vast majority of experts believed that it was 3 or 6 years. It's actually 9 years. So 1 year less than the equivalent of a man that is 30 years old for a woman that is 30 years old. But that's not how we think. And so we had experts around the world saying, well, we are going to develop policies and we are going to do this and we are going to have investments based on our perceived notion of how the world is. And when I read the book, there's a lot, I did the little quiz and I realized I'm not much better at guessing than anybody else is when it comes to that, because that's my perceived notion. These are the things that I've heard since I was young. And I also reflected on the point, and of course this got a little bit of excitement from the minister about the sorts of things that I've been subjected to as someone that was born in the 50s and grew up in the 60s and so on. Because I remember when I was a kid that it was only 8 years after the Second World War, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the key issues. And my dad was part of a civil defense where basically he was the guy that had to have the Geiger counter out there in case we had an atomic war. And so that was the sort of thing that I was subjected to when I was 7 or 8 years old, that this could be what is going to get us next is an atomic war. So then I start to hear things, well, don't worry, this is in the 60s, oil's going to be gone in 10 years. 1970s, another ice age is going to take place in 10 years. I mentioned, and this is what got people excited, that acid rain is going to destroy all of our crops in 10 years. And of course, people got excited about that. I did not, and perhaps I should have explained the significance of the work that had been done in order to mitigate those and to look at that, but I didn't. But that caused a little excitement for the minister. Similar types of things when we're discussing ozone layers. Again, there's been efforts that are associated with this. There's a lot to it, so I didn't give the 2-hour dissertation about the relationship that exists about that, but nevertheless, this is what was presented to people, and that was the point that I was trying to make, is that every once in a while, or about every 10 years, we are given the next thing to worry about. In 1997, 1998, of course, it was Y2K. Look how the world is going to fall apart because our computers can't figure out what day it is. So that was the next thing that we looked at. And of course, in 2000, we talk about when the next ice caps are going to be gone. So here's the issues there. We see it constantly, and we are constantly given a barrage of information that says that we are doomed. And every time we deal with that, we are doomed scenario, somebody is out there making money. And I think that's kind of a critical point. And I've actually, again, being old enough, I remember Greenpeace. I remember the reason for them being. I remember Patrick Moore and the efforts that he has done. But now he is some sort of a pariah in the environmental community, because he says, you know what? The people that have taken over these ecology-focused groups are not there for the environment. They are there to make sure that they can get money. And I just quote one of the things he said. I am firmly of the belief that the future will show that this whole hysteria over climate change is a complete fabrication. Now, that all depends on where your definition is, because I'm sure as the last time when the Minister of Environment took a run at me for stating some obvious facts, and when the Minister of Natural Resources took a run at me for stating some obvious facts, that the climate does change. However, what we also have to recognize is that we need to use our strengths in order to make sure that we are helping humanity. Right now, we have this thought, and we hear it constantly, the earth is boiling, all of these other kinds of things that are only meant to invoke fear in the populace. So when you have others that sit back and say, you know what, it's not quite that bad. Maybe what we should be doing is using our wealth to be able to come back to a spot where people are being looked after, that's not a bad idea. And so we have the Dubai, the COP28, is it, that's taking place right now? And the chair basically says, things aren't quite as bad as people think. Of course, now you've got the groups. Yeah, but why did we decide that we should have a climate change meeting and in some place where they actually produce oil? That's kind of a dumb thing to have done. Well, no, maybe it's simply that they understand the realities of the world, and I think that's really kind of a critical point. So then we get back to Timmins James Bay and every other riding that we have. And this is what I had mentioned, the last day, and I think it's critical. We have made decisions that says Canada somehow is going to be the leader in battery production, electric vehicle production, mining, and sadly, we say that we will do that at the same time as we are going to minimize the oil and gas industry here in North America. So our part of it. Now there's a lot of contrary aspects to that, a lot of different things associated with it. But quite frankly, we know what is taking place in the rest of the world. We know that China has a grasp on all of the supply chain as far as electric motors are concerned, as far as battery parts are concerned. These are the reasons why we see companies backing off from their pledges of by 2030, we are going to have these many electric vehicles and so on. We see that happening constantly. But here, we sit down and say, but not here in Canada. We will keep going. We're like a moose on a trail. Nothing that matters is going to change. We're going to stay on that trail. And that's where we have to be thinking about. And that's where, when I go back to this Hans Rosling book, we have this concept that says, this is what we started on, and nobody can tell us that anything else is relevant. And so therefore, we are going to continue to push this. So then we talk about, okay, well, what about C50, this just transition and so on. So then if you do a little bit of research where that came from, it is a UN discussion. And with that UN discussion, basically it started off with, there's a lady by the name of Sharon Burrow that had written a commentary. Said shared prosperity provides hope and security, and basically giving everybody a thought that, well, things are just going to be great. Well, who is she? She heads the International Trade Union Confederation. So basically, she's saying, well, if we can convince everybody that they can change their jobs, but the only way that they're being saved is because we have trade unions that are going to be part of it, and they will stand up for people. Well, that's not exactly how the world works, especially if you're looking at small businesses and the fact that anything that we have happening in this country right now, majority of it is small and medium-sized businesses. They're not associated with trade unions, and that there are parts, but that isn't the reality. But yet, here is this UN declaration that indicates that the world should be going through this just transition. So that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. So when we have the UN presenting this as one of their goals, and they say all the right things, they say all of the things that I hear our government when we go to international fora, talking about how this just transition is going to work out so well for us. But the reality is that's not the way the rest of the world is. And sadly, right now, when we talk about what is happening in Europe, and again, as I mentioned, I've been part of the OSCE, so the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. We talk about food security, we talk about energy security, and of course we talked about what is happening in Ukraine. So those are the three main issues that we have. And this was a year ago when I was talking to these people and people from Ukraine and saying, okay, well, how can we help? How can we be part of this? And things have kind of fallen apart even worse now than they were a year ago. So here, and again, if we listen to, and again, I've been on Environment Committee and Natural Resources Committee. I listen to my friends from the NDP and from the Bloc. They are adamant that there should be no nuclear energy development because of their concerns about something that I was concerned about back in the 60s because of nuclear war. We kind of realized that wasn't the reality of it, but no, they can still go back to that rhetoric that says, there's something terrible is going to happen here. They have no idea about what it's like. They have no idea about the safety associated with it. They have no idea that the reason why it is so expensive to be able to produce is because we have all of these naysayers sitting on the sidelines saying, okay, well, we got to make sure we do this and that. So they say, fine, we'll do it, we'll prove it. Once it's proven the first time, though, you'd think maybe we could get to the stage where things could proceed a little faster. And actually, they are proceeding faster now because you start to take a look at what is happening in Europe, and you see them just expanding the amount of nuclear projects that they have in order to generate electricity. So much so that the next issue is, how do we transmit that? How do we get that energy to where we need to have it if we're going to concentrate on heat pumps, if we're going to concentrate on EV vehicles and that sort of thing? We don't have a grid that can deal with that. So there's billions and billions of dollars that are associated with that part. So that's the reality that we have. And yet, so those of us in our 338 communities, we start to look at what are the opportunities, for us to be part of this new transition into electric vehicles. Well, we have to be smart about it. And sadly, I don't believe that that is the case. And as I've said on so many occasions, if you're not going to measure the environmental impact from the first shovel you use to dig something up until you're finished with it and have to shut it back in again and throw dirt on it at the end, and whether that be nuclear, hydroelectric, oil and gas, windmills, solar, any type, if you're not going to measure it, then how can you say that you are actually doing anything for the environment? But we still do. We say, yeah, but somebody told us this, or we believe this is the case, even though we might be completely wrong. But we believe it, and therefore that is the path that we are going to follow. So if we follow things that are wrong, and we spend billions or trillions of dollars globally on these issues, what other things could we have solved in the meantime? Quite frankly, if we were, I was on health committee for quite some time. If we could spend our money looking at ways of helping those that, whether it be cancer or other types of things that affect each and every one of us, if we were to be able to take the wealth that we had and to say, let's concentrate on that, instead of saying, oh, well, the U.S. is got this Inflation Reduction Act, so we better spend, we got to spend money or else we're going to be left on the wayside here. It's not going to work for them either. The situations that they're doing, it's not working from the perspective that they still have, electric vehicle plants. They have all of these types of things. They have their own companies, that are saying, we can't keep up. This 2030 thing, 2035, there's no way that is possible. We are backing away from it. So they might have great ideas, but think of what was the last great idea that happened when this government was elected. The first thing that happened was the president decided we're going to shut down Keystone XL. And the little bit of pushback that the Canadian government gave based on that was very minimal. And all that did is prevented us being able to take are rich natural resources that are produced in the most environmentally friendly way in the world, preventing it heading into the U.S. market because they didn't want it to move into the world market. Now, when they need, and people have to understand the science associated with hydrocarbons. So when you bring them in, depending upon how they come in, that's where you get the different types of products that can be used. So they need them. So now let's start talking about Venezuela. How can we bring Venezuelan oil in here, heavy oil in, so that the refineries that we have in the Gulf Coast can actually do the things they need so that these products can be presented around the world? When you have a neighbor that thinks that way about your energy resources, when you have a neighbor that says, you know what, now we are actually producing more oil and gas to send around the world than anybody else, how much do you really think that they are going to be working with us as far as partners are concerned? Now, the president can simply say, well, we sure want to be engaged with some of your mining projects so that we can have minerals for the rare earth minerals that are required, whether it be for batteries or whether it be for engines and all those sorts of things. We can look at that, and we'd be happy to make you our partners. Well, we have been partners before where we take what we have, dig it up, and send it someplace else. So, yeah, there's lots of people make money, and we chip away at our wealth, give it to somebody else, and we go from there. Now, that's not what the government is saying. The government is saying, yeah, but we're not going to allow that. We are going to be the ones that are going to be able to go in, and we will make sure that whether it's in Timmins James Bay or Red Deer Mountain View, that we're going to be able to get these products that we have, and we will try and find the supply chain to get them to markets, and everything's going to be great. Until, of course, you talk to the community and ask them what their thoughts are about different types of production in their communities. I remember people being so upset that there was simply going to be transmission power lines going through their part of the community. And these weren't because of some windmills or anything else. It was just somebody decided they wanted to change the line, and then there was a lot of discussion based on that. So that's the reality that each and every one of us is going to have to deal with when it comes to looking at what the future is going to be. Now, I know that there is amazing wealth that we have. I know there's amazing intellect that we have as a country, and we should not be stopping any options. But that does not mean that what we should be doing is shutting down one part of our economy because of an ideological bent that not just this government, but other governments around the world believe are significant. Well, I worry about that. The other governments, they still have their signatures on the bottom of these agreements, so they're not jumping up and down and saying what they're doing. But the reality is, within their borders, they are changing things. And I think that becomes a critical aspect of it. We have had people here slamming the Alberta government because they chose. As a matter of fact, I think, can't remember which minister, they're sort of a tag team on this, but had slammed Alberta because of the moratorium on renewables, okay? Whomever, but I think it was a minister. But nevertheless, but what people don't recognize is that Alberta has a massive amount of renewable, much more than other places when you talk about what has been developed over the last number of years.
We have a point of order from Mr. Bruson. Mr. Bruson, go ahead.
It's been fascinating to hear all about Venezuela and Alberta, and we're traveling a lot these days. But I would like to know, given that the sub-amendment is about witnesses in Timmins James Bay, how it's relevant, what policies are being brought by the province of Alberta in putting a moratorium on renewable energies.
Thank you for the point of order, Mr. Bruson. I'd ask you, Mr. Dreeshen, to keep it relevant back to, I think you're getting there, to the relevancy to Timmins James Bay, but just want to make sure that colleagues ensure that our debate is relevant to the sub-amendment brought forward by Mr. Falk. So thank you for that, Mr. Bruson. Mr. Dreeshen, back to you.
I suppose I should start on the point of order. So a point of order. I think that my discussion constantly has been on, and I've worked it around, and I've talked about how we as individual MPs have to look at what is happening in our surroundings. I believe that was the point that I was making. I will attempt to keep to relevance. However, my statement about the moratorium on renewables and the comment back to me was, I believe, a point of debate. Once it went to that level, when the suggestion is, oh, but what is this item as far as relevance is concerned, I believe that is when we move to debate. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that is when there should be a case of shutting down that discussion, because now it has brought back in this next level of debate to which I have had no intention of going, but it does bring that into the discussion. So that is the end of my point of order.
Thank you, and I'll remind you, Mr. Dreeshen, as you're reminding myself and others, that all colleagues should refrain to using debate in their point of order to keep it to their procedural relevancy. And I would ask you to make sure that you proceed to your comments now and not to debate during your point of order as well. And Mr. Falk, you have a point of order.
A point of order, yeah. Just in regards to that, I think Mr. Dreeshen was doing a very good job of building a case. And, I'm not unfamiliar with the construction industry, Mr. Chair, and I know that just using a house as an example, it's nice to just be able to have the house, but before you have the house, you've got to do some excavation, you've got to lay a foundation, and you've got to build on that foundation before you end up getting with the house. And so when there's these points of order based on relevance that are brought up, I don't think that they're compensating enough and they're showing enough latitude to an individual that's actually building the foundation for the case that he's presenting. And I think that's a very important part of debate here. And the Liberals like to call out members of a Conservative Party on relevance. But it is absolutely relevant that you build a strong foundation before you start to construct a structure on top of that. And I think that's what Mr. Dreeshen was doing. He's building the foundation to make his point.
Thank you, Mr. Falk, on your point of order and also providing some additional context around the debate that Mr. Dreeshen was providing through your own debate. But I think this is a time, colleagues, for me to reflect also on the House of Commons procedure and practice book that I have on a few occasions over the last few months as we've had this debate and reading some important passages. So this important passage is on page 629, and I think, colleagues, I don't have my reading glasses with me, but I do want to read this because, oh, thank you. Let's, well, no, these are quite good. And I think this is important because a lot of today's conversation has been on on relevance. And so on relevance, I want to read this passage on the top of page 629. In doing so, speakers tend to be mindful of the need for some leniency. At times, they have allowed references to other matters in debate if they were made in passing and were not the principal theme of the speech. So I think that provides some additional context to committee members on the importance of relevancy. If you would like to read on your own the passage prior and the passage after this, I would ask committee members to do so to go into further understanding of the importance of the rule of relevance. Thank you, colleagues. Mr. Dreeshen, I'm going to turn the floor back to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just hoping that you'd have a chance to see things through the eyes of the Conservatives there for a moment. But nevertheless, the point that I was making was that sometimes governments have to pause, have to look at the realities of the things that are taking place. And that doesn't matter whether it is in my province of Alberta, whether it is in Quebec, whether it is in the Maritimes, whether it is in Ontario, no matter where they are, in the territories, and rather than name all the provinces. But that's my point, is that if you don't have a government that sits back or have people that say, you know what, we find out that we've got some issues here, we better back off. So that's the same sort of thing that's going to happen if there is a mining project set up for my riding or Mr. Falk's riding or Ms. LaPointe's riding or whomever or Ms. Jones's riding. You have to deal with not only the community, but then the province or territory has to deal with not only the community, but the company and the federal government. So those are the points that I am making. So when I talk about what has happened in Alberta, where and getting back to what I had said, where the massive amount of renewable resource development has taken place, and it continued to take place. And then, of course, we got somebody that supported had a support of 170,000 union workers talking about, oh, this is terrible. It's going to take $33 billion out. I think the minister, I can't remember. They're interchangeable. The natural resources minister or the environment minister said the same thing. Nonsense, but nevertheless the same thing. You have to worry, and the reality is, in my community, as in any other people's community, when you've got groups saying, we'd like to take maybe 11 quarters of land, good farmland, we want to take that out of production and we want to put in solar panels. 11 quarters of land. If that doesn't mean that you should sit back a little bit and to take a look at it, then I don't know what does. I know that the farmers advocate from Alberta told these people, you better really make sure you know what's taking place, because at this point in time, it's the wild, wild west when it comes to these groups. It's not like oil and gas where there's somebody there to say this is how it has to be dealt with once it's gone. This isn't the way it is. And it isn't the way it is there. And the same sort of thing happens when it be windmill projects and so on. They're only designed for 20, 30 years. And I've got, as I mentioned, I've had one that, it's about probably 15 years since it started. Well, it takes a lot more of the environment to deal with putting them up and getting to them and the roads associated with them and the hydrocarbons that are needed to build them in the first place and the hydrocarbons that are needed to keep them running in the second place. So a government basically said, we better have a plan for this. And therefore, we are going to have a moratorium on other projects, the things that are still in the books. There's never a problem, although we were told that that's going to stop everything. Well, that was, again, not true. So that's what happened there. And it should be happening around the whole country, that people look and say, is this really the right thing? Because when you start digging up a mine, a pit mine someplace, they're not going to be like Fort McMurray. They're not going to turn it back into a forest when they're done. It's going to be a hole in the ground. So those are the things that people have to be aware of. And I question whether we are when we follow this ideological bent. And again, coming back to what I had mentioned before, we do not have the right information in front of us. We believe certain groups that come at us with passion and commitment to their cause. but we never take the time to figure out how does that affect us as Canadians? How does that affect our communities? And that, to me, is where I think we need this sober second thought. Now, the just transition part, and again, this is going to affect people all over, so not just Alberta, but it's going to affect people in the entirety of Canada. When we take a look at what is taking place there, the union leadership says, oh, that's great. Here's another chance for us to kind of look at the new jobs that are there, and we get a chance to be part of that expansion, and we'll be able to have more members. Trying to make people think that most people in this country are unionized. Okay? Not necessarily the case. The other part is them basically saying the investments that have been made in hydrocarbons were a mistake. And so, therefore, we go back, and again, I've been years on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, as it was called back in those days. We are stranding billions of dollars of Indigenous investment with the policies of this government. I have said it before, and I see other people using the term now. We are eco-colonialists. Mm-hmm. We believe that this is best for the Indigenous people of this country. They would love to have jobs working on windmills and solar panels or other types of things. But we should not be encouraging them to continue to invest in, continue to work in the hydrocarbons that they have spent decades perfecting their skills. And if we continue to do that, we are so naive. And if there's always going to be some group that'll say, "Oh yeah, whatever the government says, there's a box to check, and there's going to be this to happen if we do that, and it'll make our lives easier if we've checked off any box that the government has." And it doesn't matter what government, if this is their plan, well, then the best thing to do is to find somebody that really knows how to write a proposal, and then send it to the bureaucrats.
Question de règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Monsieur.
Point of order.
Simplement par curiosité.
Just out of curiosity, I remember Earl told us last week that we could make the planet a more peaceful planet because of hydrocarbon.
We're talking about eco-colonialism. I didn't know that Earl was a leftist who wanted to fight against colonialism. But my question is, how is this related to the sub-amendment to bring in people from Timmins, James Bay as witnesses? I don't know if eco-colonialists are especially linked to Timmins, James Bay people, but maybe my colleague can explain to me what the link is between eco-colonialism and having people from Timmins, James Bay come as witnesses. I'm curious. I'd like to hear what he says.
Of order, and I think at a very crucial moment of making sure that the comments that are being presented to debate are relevant to the folks, the stakeholders, the individuals who all come from Timmins, James Bay, and the importance of it. So I would ask you, Mr. Dreeshen, to make sure that we get to tying it into the importance of that in making our argument. But before I proceed back to you, Mr. Dreeshen, I have Ms. Latanzio patiently with her hand up online, and I apologize, Ms. Latanzio, if I did not see you earlier, but I do see your hand up, so I want to acknowledge you now on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. So I'm listening very attentively here this morning, and I thank all members for their interventions. I would like to get clarification from Mr. Dreeshen in terms of the definition and how he defines this new term that I've heard this morning on eco-colonialism or eco-colonialists. I'd like for him to maybe provide me more details with regards to this term. And yes, I agree with my other colleague how this new term is relevant to the sub-amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Latanzio, for your point of order, and Mr. Simard as well. We are not debating eco-colonialism here at committee today, as we may want to moving forward through a study. So I would ask my colleague to, if it does tie into the relevancy of Timmins James Bay and the inclusion of those stakeholders, that Mr. Dreeshen, you do so, and so these committee members can also think about the importance of your of that connection to eco-colonialism to the sub-amendment introduced by Mr. Falk.
Well, thank you very much, and I noticed that everybody did want to get into the debate on eco-colonialism. First of all, it's been a term that when I was in Environment Committee that people from First Nations have used. So although people might believe that I'm attempting to claim it, it is not mine. But that does happen. That is what has been said. I don't have, as again, I see this melding between my time in environment and my time here at Natural Resources. I tried to look at the mandate letters. I couldn't see any difference between the two. And of course, we have a Minister of Natural Resources that still thinks that he's the Minister of Environment. So I can't remember which one, whether it was discussions here or was discussions there. But I didn't coin it. It is from there. And it's somewhat ironic that when Charlie is here and we talk about his community, I would think that is where you would find a lot of First Nation people that want to be engaged in whatever type of development is going to take place, whether it's building a road to get there, getting the power coming from there. I've had lots of discussions with First Nations leadership from Ontario and talking about this exact commentary. And yeah, they know that if they have to follow the government's mantra, there are certain boxes they have to check off. But they also know that those things that are important to their community, if you have got a higher power that believes that it and it alone dictates how things are going to be done, that is exactly the colonialism that has been part of the discussion for over 100 years. So I welcome the comment on it, but again, there are a lot of First Nations people that believe that they should be the ones that have the right to make decisions in their lands. And it's not me that presented that, even though I would be happy to take claim for it, because quite frankly, that is exactly what is happening when we talk about investments that people have. And yes, it sort of ties into the fact, well, there's a lot more people that is being affected by that mindset than just Native communities. And so perhaps that's where the confusion is. But they believe that these things require us to work together. And you take, grasping for his first name now, but Chief Heelan from British Columbia. And one of his books that he had is Dancing with Dependencies, which I would suggest that people read. Just talking about what it's like being a leader in Indigenous communities and the types of things that have prevented them from being able to do those things that are important for their community. But if we get to that stage, and again, their communities have invested in oil and gas, and mining and everything, and fishing and forestry. So a lot of different things that communities in BC have been involved with. I think that they would agree that there is a mindset here that says Ottawa knows best. As a matter of fact, Ottawa seemed to know best when they chose to take C-50 out of our hands. The whole reason for that is because of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision that said parts of C-69 were unconstitutional. So therefore, the development of a bill that speaks to the workings in communities on a philosophy that says we will do as much as we can to stop oil and gas development or any types of development, forget what the Supreme Court says. So when that affects that bill, and when that then takes us to the next part that talks about C-49, where there are 33 references to the egregious parts of C-69 within that bill, and we get nothing from the government to say, you know what, maybe we should wait a bit. Maybe we should get some reference points. All we get from the government and from the minister is, well, we don't believe that. That's just their opinion. Yeah, it's their opinion, and therefore you should do something about it. Otherwise, you throw legislation to us, to each and every one of us sitting here, that says you have to rubber stamp something that you know the Supreme Court has said is unconstitutional. So how then are we supposed to proceed? We've waited. C-69, the discussion of C-69 and these egregious points from the Supreme Court ruling, we've waited for some discussion on that. People talk about how long October was. Okay. Well, we're still waiting. We're waiting for the Supreme Court decision to be addressed by this government rather than, oh, it doesn't matter. Those are the issues that we have, which is why then we come back to say, well, if people don't agree with this.
Mr. Dreeshen, I would just ask you to pause for a moment. We have a point of order by Ms. Lapointe.
I just want to, again, ask my colleague for relevance. We're not here debating C-69. We're actually here debating a motion and a sub-amendment to a motion that deals with C-49 and C-50.
Thank you, Ms. Lapointe, for your point of order. And Mr. Dreeshen, I would just ask you to keep it relevant to the motion at hand that was presented by Mr. Cabrera and amended, and now in the sub-amendment to Timmins James Bay, that inclusion of Timmins James Bay stakeholders and community as presented in the sub-amendment by Mr. Falk. So relevancy to the sub-amendment and how it connects. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And usually how this goes, then it takes another 5 minutes to go back and state the same types of things to prove the relevancy that was associated with it. If we don't deal with C-69, and we deal with, and we can't therefore properly dispose of the discussions associated with C-50, and if we then can't properly look at and be prepared to look at decisions with regards to C-49, then anything we talk about within our own communities is held up by this blockage of legislation. So, of course, those things that happen in Timmins James Bay are relevant to the discussion we're taking place here. Because when you have people like the Indigenous community to come and say, hey, is the government overstepping its reach? Do you feel that you are back in a colonial era? Okay, so that was the last topic that we were talking about. So those are community people. And, specifically to Timmins James Bay, we could go to that. We look at the egregious parts of the Supreme Court ruling, which will affect Timmins James Bay people. Because if we have something else that we put into legislation and then we merrily go along our way saying, okay, well, government said this is true. Oh, guess what? Supreme Court doesn't like that one either. Why did the government of Ontario, or why did this group, or why, is it trying to remember? I think First Nations have taken the government to court too. I think this has happened on the carbon tax, but that's a different story. So I would agree that is perhaps outside of this. But I really think it's relevant. How can you not say that the Supreme Court is making decisions and they affect everybody's riding? Because they do. Excuse me. So I believe that is certainly significant. I look at, and again, when I fly over, that part of our country twice a week, and unless it's at night, I take a look down there, and I see this amazing country that we have. I know that we have 6 time zones from one side to the other. I know that there are only 3 provincial capitals that are north of the 49th parallel. I know that the massive amount of our population is within 50 miles, 80 kilometers, just to prove that I'm bilingual in math. So that's where our population is. And those decisions then are made for the breadth of this nation. Decisions are made for communities, and they don't see what this country is like. So, yeah, it concerns me. And so therefore, when someone says, yeah, but Alberta, you want this, or BC, you want this, or Saskatchewan, they're not being reasonable, or this, it's coming from a government that doesn't care, because their decisions are made for what they believe is those that are hugging the U.S. border. And so therefore, Inflation Reduction Act, all of these kinds of things are kind of significant, because where do you think all that action is going to come from? Where is all these billions of dollars going to be spent? They're going to be spent right next door. And so that's what we're going to see. And quite frankly, no one has challenged them to say, is that the right thing to be doing? So when they say, oh, we're going to put billions of dollars into this project, that project, well, here's how they're doing it. They are basically saying to the states and the municipalities, it's not going to cost you a dime. We're going to develop all of this, and we'll find out some way to get this back from the proponents later on. Not going to cost you a dime. How sustainable is that, first of all? Well, it's a lot more sustainable if you're the U.S. than it is here. Because we look at the way our economy is tanking compared to the U.S., and so they have this flexibility. It's still wrong, but they do have this flexibility to continue in a wrong way for a lot longer than we do. It's going to take a lot of nerve to be able to say, here's where our strengths are. We know that Canada can produce natural gas. We know that the world needs natural gas. We know that different parts of our nation have different strengths, and they have different ways of creating energy. The worst part, though, is when one part of the country says, we don't like yours, so shut her down. And we'll do all we can. We will partner with like-minded individuals that really don't believe that your type of energy is the kind of energy that Canada should have. Again, they don't make it too far off of the 49th parallel when they come up with decisions like that. So I guess that's where we find this disconnect that we have as a nation. Take a look at all of the potential natural gas that we could have in Quebec. Go get it. Could use it. But that would sort of take the narrative away from, oh, well, we want to use all of our energy. We've already got this area flooded, so now we have this green energy coming out of hydroelectric power. So as long as nobody goes back and thinks about what it was like prior to that and the displacement of animals and humans and so on to get to that stage, as long as we ignore that, then it's great. Everyone should be happy. I remember, as a kid, well, I guess I wasn't a kid at that time, but these are friends of mine, when the Red Deer River was dammed. So these are friends of mine whose land they lost. It had to be sold so that they could dam up the river. And for years after it, people loved it. Looked good because you can put a sailboat on it and everything. It looks fantastic. Must be environmental. Until you see these trees popping out. They pop up once the lake bed has deteriorated. We know the methane that comes out of those. We know that any of the minerals, then get dissolved and the toxic minerals that are associated with it. We know all of those sorts of things. But, it looks good. And, I congratulate the people in the community that take this facility and use it in a positive way. I don't go back and complain about it. I'm not complaining about what the people in Quebec do. And I wouldn't, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't be, even if I was a environmentalist, I wouldn't go to Quebec if they were getting ready to go and flood the whole place to get their hydroelectric power. I wouldn't tell them they couldn't. I'd say, it's up to you. You make that decision. But don't come back to me and say, hey, Alberta, we don't like your oil and gas, and we're going to stand up here, and we're going to make sure that you don't get to do that. Yeah. I see. Is that the duplicitous? I'm not sure whether that's maybe two ways of looking at things. But I have no idea what the word was when you said it in the first place. But anyway, that's okay.
Point of order.
We have a point of order by Mr. Bruson.
Quite truthfully, look it up in the dictionary, but duplicitous has a very specific meaning. And if he doesn't know what it means, then he shouldn't be using it in his place, and certainly not towards other members of this committee. Learn what the word means before you start using it towards people.
Good point. Mr. Bruson, thank you for your point of order. Colleagues, other point of orders? No. Okay. Mr. Dreeshen, I'm going to come back to you.
And corrected. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that you had ruled on the word before. Perhaps at the time we should have had a dictionary so that all of us could have been informed of the seriousness of that particular term. But that's the thing about points of order. Then you have to kind of go back a ways to figure out just where you were on your thoughts. But I'll try not to go over many points on it. But I was talking about how you can respect other Canadians and why that is important. I mentioned having gone to Central America, on Parlamerica business and having the Bloc there and the Liberals and the NDP, and of course we were government at that time, and the Bloc basically said, hey, we love Canada. We love Quebec. Two great countries. That part but anyway, but they still said that, And so it was a case where they knew that if we have a strong Canada, it strengthens them, and they are part of it, and they can move forward. And now, in the last 8 years, they see one group being pitted against the other. This group doesn't work. That one, everybody hates each other. And they sit back and they say, we can't be part of this group. Look at how dysfunctional this country is. Well, okay, it only took 8 years to use a different mindset to, in their case, make the point of their own point. Okay? But it's the reality. We see that happening. I really think it's something that we should recognize, because I remember when we had this major issue with aluminum coming in from China. And basically all they had to do, and it came in actually through Mexico, but it would go into China and they'd do some little thing to kind of hook it up and say, okay, now it's a product of Mexico, and then we can bring it into the U.S. and we can bring it into Canada. And that was going exactly against the aluminum industry in Quebec. And we stood up for Quebec's aluminum industry because it was wrong as to what was taking place. Some days, it'd be nice to know that people thought about the rest of the country in the same manner. And so, Mr. Chair, I believe that I can see that you are looking at the clock. I thank you for the time.
Juste petit point d'ordre, juste.
Point of order. Just to inform my colleague Earl about what he said, the amendment of the free trade agreement on aluminum was carried out because the Bloc MPs mobilized people in the region where most of the aluminum is produced. But unfortunately, the Conservative MP from Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord did not join that effort, which meant he was criticized by many stakeholders. So when my colleague says that everyone stood together to support the aluminum sector, there was a big aspen, his colleague from Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. So maybe then I would have better done to work with Earl than his colleague in Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord if I wanted to support the aluminum sector. I just wanted to underline that fact.
Samard for providing that intervention on the point of order and context to that. And great job by the interpreters for making sure that was clear all the way through. Thank you. Colleagues, at that end of that point of order, I know Mr. Dreeshen was wrapping up and finish. Just before we do maybe finish the meeting today, because we are at time, I would just like to do... we have a small item that I wanted to ask colleagues for just a moment. With your indulgence to deal with an administrative matter, the clerk had circulated a budget a while ago related to a meeting we had on October the 16th with Suncor CEO Rich Kruger. This is the first time we've had a chance to discuss this since that meeting took place. So I want to get your approval for the budget. Is there agreement by members to adopt the budget in the amount of $4,500 by unanimous consent? Yes. All right. Thank you, colleagues. And thank you, colleagues, for that. And on a point of order by Mr. Dreeshen.
I did have more to say. I'm not sure. I believe that you had more or less said that I was finished, but I see the clock. So.
Yes. No, Mr. Dreeshen, I will... you were not finished in your debate, and you still have the floor. So we will end there today. Meeting is suspended. Thank you.